For about 13 years I lived in La Bella Italia, Italy. One of the things that I came to like best about the city of Venice, Venezia, is its silence, because there are no cars. The place has about it a kind of tranquility, therefore, that is good for the human heart and soothing for the human soul. Venice looks and feels and sounds like a city that is of human dimension. And that's the thing about the place that I came to like best. It's like the desert. I don't know if you've spent time in the desert. I have a little bit. I spent about 10 days in the desert south of Jerusalem, called the Negev. And one of the things, and I'm a dyed-in-the-wool city slicker, going from cities into the desert was challenging, but also fascinating. And one of the things that really did fascinate me was the quality of silence. We don't know what silence is in the city, but you do in the desert. A silence that is so intense you could almost kind of cut it with a knife or eat it. It becomes a presence. There's a story in the Bible, and you might know it, of the prophet Elijah, who was running away from the murderous King Ahab and his even more murderous Queen Jezebel. And he takes refuge in a cave on a mountain, the holy mountain of God, Mount Horeb. And God says to the prophet, I am going to pass by on the mountain. In this dramatic moment in your life, I'm going to pass by. And then we're told there was a sound of a huge earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. Then there was the sound of a mighty storm, but God wasn't in the storm. And then there was a huge fire, but God wasn't in the fire. And then we're told the prophet in his cave heard the voice of a thin silence. Seems crazy, doesn't it? A voice of a thin silence. And at that point, the prophet goes to the cave and covers his face because he couldn't look upon God, but God was in the voice of a thin silence. In the desert, there is a silence so intense that it becomes a little thin ringing in your ears. It's a kind of a little voice that's born out of silence, nothingness, absence, and yet it rings in your ears. And that's the voice of God according to the Bible. Now, our world, the world that you and I know, wherever you're from, is a very, very noisy world. Not just because of traffic, but for 100 other reasons. It's a very, very noisy world, and the noise out there becomes noise in here. There's static everywhere outside of us, but it becomes static of the heart. So we can find ourselves, as it were, drowning in noise. We live in a very loud world. But when we say living louder is the theme of our gathering here today at Powerhouse, we're not talking about more noise. In fact, if we want to live louder, not just make more noise, but make more impact, that's what we're really talking about, real human impact, then in fact we don't need more noise out there or in here, we need less noise. And that's hard in a world like ours. It's like swimming against the current. It's hard work to swim against the tide. So, in such a world, we, and I do mean we, I'm a lot older than you, but it doesn't matter what age you are, all of us need to learn more and more what I would call the art of silence. If you want to live louder in a way that's genuinely human, that's where you start. Less is more. You have to learn an art of silence. And when I think of our Catholic schools, they are fantastic schools. But if at the heart of everything our Catholic schools teach and impart to you, there is not the learning of the art of silence, then in some sense we've failed. All we've taught you is noise. So one of the key things about our Catholic schools, whatever our other schools and what they do, we have to teach you in some way an art of silence that is countercultural. Wolfgang Mozart, all heard of him? Yes. Possibly the greatest musical genius that the West has produced, who knows? The story is told that once Mozart was asked, what did he like best about his music? And the genius, who died at 36, thought for a moment, and then he said, the silences. Seems an extraordinary answer from the great composer, who was, you might say, an expert in making noise, but noise of the highest quality. What did he mean? Mozart meant that there are two silences. There's a silence that is cold and dark and empty, and therefore terrifying. It's the silence that's full of absence. It's the silence of the tomb. But there is another silence. It's the silence that is full of light, that is full of warmth and joy and presence, and that is the silence of the womb. And what Mozart is saying is that the whole point of his music is to transfigure the first silence and make it the second silence. That's the power of great music. Any music. It takes the silence of the tomb, dark, empty, absent, terrifying, and transforms it into a silence that's full of joy and life and presence. And that's why Mozart said, I like the silences, because they are transfigured, they are transformed. Our task is to do exactly the same. Jesus wasn't a composer like Mozart, but he is the great transfigurer of the silences of this world, because there are so many dark silences. And the real God doesn't just sit back and do nothing faced with those silences. The real God gives us Jesus as the one who transfigures all of that, who turns death to life. The tomb becomes a womb. And once that happens, you can live louder in the way that you want to live, a life that's more intense, a life that's fuller, more joyful, more creative, more human. That's what it means, surely, for us to live louder. If we look at Jesus risen from the dead, and if we listen to someone like Mozart, you might remember a song by Simon and Garfunkel. God knows you're probably too young to remember Simon and Garfunkel. I remember them very well. But one of their most famous songs was The Sound of Silence. I won't sing it for you, but you may have heard it. The title is spot on. What they're talking about is the silence that speaks. But in order to learn the art of that silence, and it is an art, and it does have to be learned, we have to learn to listen. Now, does that sound easy? Because if it does, think again. It's not easy. Because there's so much noise out there, there's so much noise in here. One of the most difficult things of all is to learn to listen. And yet without that, we simply cannot live a truly human life. If our ears are closed or open but saturated with noise, sooner or later the heart of flesh begins to harden and it ends up being a heart of stone. You don't want that, but it can happen. God certainly doesn't want it, and will do everything he can to prevent it. The whole experience of listening is at the very heart of biblical religion. And all of us, whoever you are all born from the matrix of biblical religion. If we look at the whole of the Old Testament, there's one word that stands at the head of it all. Shema Yisrael. That's the Hebrew. Translation, listen, Israel. There's the word, listen. Now, you've got to believe that there is a voice to be heard. If you think the silence is just dark and empty and there's nothing and no one there, why would you bother trying to listen? You've got to believe that there is a voice there and that listening will lead to life. Probably the most influential text in the whole of Western Christianity, and we're all the products of Western Christianity, in one way or another, is what we call the Rule of St. Benedict. St. Benedict, in the 5th century, was the father of Western monasticism. And he wrote a rule that has been incredibly influential, not just religiously. In some ways it brought European civilization to birth. And again, if you look at the rule of St. Benedict, the very first word in the rule is ausculta. Listen, my son, my daughter, to the words of the Master. Again, listening in a way that leads to life. But you'll never learn to listen unless you learn to be silent. Not only externally, that can matter. In fact, it matters to me more and more as I get older. When I get into my car, almost as a reflex action, I turn the radio on. But sometimes I think to myself, why the heck am I listening to this? I turn it off and the silence is much better, even better than music. I mean, music is good, but sometimes there is a silence that's even better, more powerful. Think too of the silences when you have a very large crowd of people together and they enter into an experience of silence. We'll do this in just a moment. But I will never forget when Pope Francis was elected Pope. And they brought the new Pope out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, as they always do, and he was there to give the blessing to the people, as popes always do. But at one point, Pope Francis did something that astonished me, as one who worked in the Vatican for a while. He said to the crowd, and there was a huge crowd of people in St. Peter's Square, he said to them, now before I give you the blessing, I want you to pray for me. We'd never heard of that. It works the other way, we thought. And now he's saying, no, it's not just me to you, it's you to me. He said, I want you to pray for me. And as it were, to bless me before I bless you. And the new Pope bent down And there was silence in St. Peter's Square with hundreds of thousands of people there, and it was a silence that was full of power. A silence that spoke in a way that words could never have done. The Pope could have got up there and given the best speech of all time, but it wouldn't have had the power of all of those people in a moment of silence praying for the new Pope. Unforgettable. You see it too in the secular world, Anzac Day, where for just a minute during the last post, you could have 80 or 90,000 people at a football game, or hundreds of people gathered in the cathedral for Mass. And in that moment of silence, again, there is a power and an eloquence that is so much louder than any noise could ever be. That's the silence we have to learn. And it takes a whole lifetime to learn it. It's a way of entering into the silences of God. See, the Word of God is often a silence. God doesn't yabber away all the time. God communicates ceaselessly, but often through a kind of silence, what I sometimes think of as the hush of ecstasy. God is ecstasy, and I'm not talking about a pill. I'm talking about the real thing. And you see, it was for ecstasy that we were created. God wants to draw us into that. Not into disillusionment, disenchantment, devastation, defeat, destruction, all those D words that end in death. That's not why we're here. And why we're called into eternity. We're called into the hush of ecstasy, the silence that speaks in a way that words could never do. Living louder. It's an intriguing theme that we've taken this year. And the text that came to me when I first saw the theme was the text of St. Paul in one of his letters, one of his most important and longest letters, to the church in Corinth, in Greece. Towards the end of that letter, he wrote words that I read at almost every wedding ceremony I've ever attended or celebrated. And the words are these: "If I have all the eloquence of human beings and of angels, but speak without love, then I am simply a gong booming or a cymbal clashing." I'll give it to you again. If I have all the eloquence of human beings and of angels, but am without love, I am the gong booming and the cymbal clashing. And I can tell you now, in a noisy world, we do not need more booming gongs and clashing cymbals. We need gongs and cymbals, but not empty booming and empty clashing. Paul says that it's love that makes the difference. I have said you have to learn an art of silence in order to learn the art of listening. But in fact, you have to listen in order to learn the way of love. Because in the end, living louder without love will be simply more noise, less impact. And we don't need that. Not from leaders. In Greek, and Paul dictated his letter in Greek, there are 3 words for love. The first of them is eros, from which we get the word erotic. It's love under its aspect of desire. Very important. The second word is philia, which is love under its aspect of friendship. Again, a very important part of the experience of human love and divine love. But the third word, and this is the one Paul uses, is agape. And this is love under its aspect of self-sacrifice, which is really the molten core of what we mean by love. So in other words, we could take his words and adapt them. If I have all the eloquence there is in heaven or on earth, but am without self-sacrificing love, have not learnt to sacrifice myself, then there's just more noise and less impact. The booming gong and the clashing cymbal. To live louder is to live more expansively, more ecstatically, more humanly, and therefore more like God. It does mean having more impact. By that I mean creating others by sacrificing yourself. It's the only way you will create others. And as a leader, what else are we called to do but to create others? As God does. Again, leadership is always God-like, or if it's not, it will be demonic and won't be leadership of any kind. On Saturday in San Salvador, in Central America, Archbishop Oscar Romero, of whom you may have heard, was beatified. That's the step on the way to being a saint. Now, Oscar Romero was shot while he was saying Mass by the military regime whom he opposed because they were incredibly destructive in the life of the people whom Oscar Romero was called to serve as bishop. They shot him to shut him up. No more from Archbishop Romero, they thought, as he lay dead at the foot of the altar. But in fact, what was brilliantly evident on Saturday, there were 300,000, 400,000 people at his funeral, at his beatification. At his funeral, there'd been 250,000. What they did when they loudly shot down that church and killed the Archbishop, what they did was guarantee that Oscar Romero's witness and voice ring out forever, long after the gunfire has ceased. All the guns fall silent, but Romero's voice will still be heard, living louder, far, far louder than those who killed him. They thought they had the power, but he was the one who had it. They were weak. He was strong. To live louder, like Romero and so many others, means to be silent, to listen, but in the end, to love, to give yourself away. Sacrifice. Romero knew he was going to be shot. Towards the end, there was an inevitability about his death. It didn't stop him, though. He wasn't a prisoner of fear. He'd taken a path, he'd made a choice, and there was no turning back. It meant his death, and he knew it was coming. But still, there was one power stronger than death, and that's that power of agape that Paul talks about. The self-sacrificing love that ensures we're not just a gong booming and then falling dead silent, or a cymbal clashing and then falling dead silent, but living that human life that goes forth again and again and again infinitely into the abyss of God. That's what it means to live louder. There's a paradox in this. You know what a paradox is? Something that's very strange but very true. What I'm saying is you can't live louder unless you live quieter in the way that I've suggested. But you see it too, not up there, it's me. Powerhouse of leaders, we call this, and rightly so. I mean, this is not just a powerhouse we're in, you are a powerhouse, and I mean that. I did a couple of short interviews before I gave this talk, and I said this is a crucial gathering, not only because you're the school leaders now, but you're going to be the leaders into the future in all kinds of ways. So you are a powerhouse, far more of a powerhouse than the very building we gather in. That's just a label. But to say you are a powerhouse, that's not just a label, that's the truth. But in fact, you will never exercise real power unless you learn a kind of powerlessness. The kind of powerlessness that enables you to lead a life of self-sacrifice. The way those guys, Nick and Lucas, are, they could be doing 100 other things. Why are they doing what they're doing? Good question. So just as you can never live louder unless you live quieter, you can't be powerful, really powerful, unless you let go. If all you've got in your hand is a gun or a booming gong or a clashing cymbal, you won't be powerful. You might be other things, dominating, domineering, and so on it goes, but you won't be powerful. Romero was far more powerful, is far more powerful than those who assassinated him. But similarly, leadership. There's a paradox here too. You'll never be a leader. You might be a brute or a boss, but you'll never really be a leader unless you learn to serve. The Son of Man, we told in the Gospel we read, came not to be served, but to serve. And there's the key to leadership in any time and place, and I'm talking about real leadership. You'll never live louder unless you live quieter. You'll never be powerful unless you learn and choose a kind of powerlessness. And you will never lead unless you learn to serve again and again and again. Lest I sound like a gong booming or a cymbal clashing, it's time for me to return to the silence from which I came. So what I'm going to do now is invite you, just for a brief time, at the end of the words, just to go into the silence. Not the silence that's disquieting, disturbing, difficult, but a silence in which you can relax and sense peace, be at ease with yourself and those who gather with you here. So let's all of us now, just for a short time, put behind us that dark, empty, threatening silence and enter the silence that is full of light and presence and peace and even the promise of joy. So let's together enter into that kind of silence for just a moment. Together we share that gift.